Just a moment. Um, Hello, everyone. I, Chetna, welcome you all on behalf of The Dark for our 25th Dark Baithak. The Dark began in 2023 as a book review journal publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the start, we sought to reimagine the form of the book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage deeply, reflectively, and creatively with the world a book opens up. Over time, we grew into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explore the intersections across social sciences. The Dark Baithak is our humble attempt to huddle around a small gathering of scholars, writers, and students from different fields to present ideas and initiate dialogue, bringing critical conversations to life. Our session today is titled Not Identity but Reciprocity Reading Dharma and Jotiba Phule. Our speaker is Dr. Anagha Ingole. Dr. Anagha teaches at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, India. She has a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and has been a Fulbright Nehru postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, New York. Her research interests are political theory, politics of caste and religion, and the global intellectual history. Our discussant today is Pratham. Pratham is a student pursuing development studies at the Ambedkar University, Delhi. Dr. Ingole, if you're comfortable, we can begin now.
Sure. Thank you,
Dr.
Chetna.
Dr. Ingole.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Okay. So thank you, Chetna and Jigyasa. So what I'm doing today is I'm going to present Jotiba Phule's Sarvajanik Satyadharma Pustak, which is a text which was written in 1889 and was published posthumously as an intertextual commentary by placing it in a literary and a hermeneutical context, that is an interpretative context. I do this to read the conception of dharma in the formulation Sarvajanik Satya Dharma as emerging in contention with certain claims and efforts of restoring, replacing, or reforming the extant notions of dharma in Phule's own time. So let me speak briefly about the task of establishing this text, which I will now call the SSD heretofore, as an intertextual illocutionary act, and why this is a sort of necessary prior task that must be taken up to read the work that Jotiba does on this contested concept of dharma. Right? It's a really overworked concept in the Indian tradition of thinking and thought. So I begin by treating Sarvajanik Satyadharma Pustak as, or SSD, as a tract on dharma rather than as an epistle for the members of the Satyashodhak Samaj or for the non-Brahmin people in general. That is, I do not deal with the work that the text is supposed to do in the world outside, but I focus on the internal world of the text to retrieve its intellectual sources, linguistic imagination, expression, strategies of interpretation and translation that all inform the cogitation and development of an understanding of dharma in Jotiba. In J.L. Austin's terms, it wishes to focus on what are called the illocutionary utterances by reading the text in its context, but does not go to the perlocutionary effects. That is the work that the text is supposed to do in the world outside. Apart from the methodological necessity, I do this also because it is easily assumed that the intentionality of the act that Phule was undertaking via his anti-Brahminical writing is somehow very transparent and obvious. This assuredness is pervasive in the limited scholarly studies on Jotiba Phule, which are immensely helpful, but they restrict one from asking a question about the appropriate methodological invention that is to be motivated in order to study a work like the Sarvajanik Satyadharma Pustak as a literary act. So Jonathan Ganeri, who's a philosopher, in his essay writes on the possibility of thinking and intellectual history in relation to Indian texts. And he argues that there is immense intertextuality, that is conversation among texts, but there is a limited physical context for most Indian texts, especially in the case of classical texts. Keeping this background in mind, The case of someone like Jotiba Phule as someone not writing in the classical but the modern period is peculiar. In his case, we have not only sparse physical context but also very limited intertextual context. That is, we don't know what is the text that he was reading, what are the texts that he was referring to, and so on. So, despite the fact that he operates in a period advanced in terms of a rich and abundant record of written exchange, accounting, and referencing, we don't have much written evidence apart from the texts that are attributed to him and some works that he cites in his writings. So there is undeniably a thick context to which he is writing, or to which his writing is a response. But the excavation of that intertextual or interliterary context remains an underdeveloped project so far. Such extreme lack of evidential context in a period that may, without exaggeration, be called a period that exhibited a really high traffic of textual exchange and recording, goes on to show the differential nature of contextual recording made and the legitimate methods of its verification that are demanded for a non-Brahmin figure like Jotiba Phule. For all these reasons, removing the text temporarily from the assumptions regarding its intentionality based on the perlocutionary goals, I'll attempt to set up an intertextual context for reading the text. I think such a setup is based on but not limited to the actual references that he makes in the text or in his other writings. It extends to employing the evidence of the texts which he republished, distributed, circulated, and the discussions on emerging ideas of dharma that he pushes back on in his writing, even when he does not mention their textual source or author. So this entire exercise rests on a sort of base claim that the work that we are looking at is an intertextual commentary that needs to be placed in a literary and interpretative context to be able to unpack the intellectual work that it does on the contested concept of dharma. So I want to begin by situating this intertextual context and the contestation over dharma in what I identify as three registers in which dharma was being imagined in his time. Okay, so the first register I call the restorative register, um, which reads that period as an age of darkness, Kali Yuga, due to the corruption of Varnashrama Dharma. Right, so it was a crossing over of Varnas, Varna Sankara, which had disturbed the proper order of things and beings, and its restoration was to be the restoration of Dharma. Okay, I use a text from mid 14th to 15th century. It's called Jati Bheda Viveka Sara by Gopinath, and then Tukaram Tatya Padwar's Jati Viveka. And these texts, I argue, can perform as texts that establishing the opposing contours of the view of dharma that Jotiba then develops. The second I call the replacing register, which begins by distinguishing between true and false dharmas and overhauls the reasons and sensibilities with which to access faith. Dominant strains in this register employ new modes of inquiry, such as methods of natural science and evidentiary theology, to establish the truth of faith claims, but in favor of a certain faith, in this case, Christianity. The Mata Pariksha exchange between John Moore, who was a British official and a missionary, via a text called Mata Pariksha, a sketch of the argument for Christianity and against Hinduism, and one of his respondents, Somanatha, who writes a text called Mata Pariksha Shiksha over Satya Dharma, will form the second locus of this context. And finally, the reformative register, which is emphatic in its concern with an expansive self-identity that bridges dharma and desha, country, mimicked the restorative view that the contemporary was a corruption of the pure dharma. However, what it advocated was not a simple return to the past, but a reform, a reascription of dharma from that based on birth, kula, to the one based on virtue, guna, right? So this is the guna theory, that caste is to be based not on birth, but on one's virtue. So this view is read in the works of some of the contemporaries of Jotiba, such as Dadoba Pandurang Tarkhadkar and Gopal Hari Deshmukh, right? So I won't bore you with these texts again, so I'm just flagging them now, and now I'll just speak about the views. It is primarily in its work on these three registers and the invocation of dharma that Jotiba constructs what he calls the Sarvajanik Satya Dharma. So let me begin with the restorative register, the Varna Shrama Dharma register. So in the SSD, Jotiba does not use the terms Varna Dharma or Hindu Dharma. He uses the term Arya Bhattansa Dharma, which means the Dharma of the Arya Brahmins, invoking not the classical meaning of Dharma attached to Arya Varta, but asserting that what existed as Varna Dharma was the Dharma of the Arya Brahmins of his day. He uses the historical accounts by British writers extensively to draw upon the theses of Aryan migration. But in his own time, the sharpening of caste hierarchies and the texts that were invoked and produced to speak to these developments seem to have equally laid the ground against which he developed his own ideas, a source that has remained underutilized. Such identification requires that one goes beyond the direct references that Jyotiba gives us in his writings and read into the debates that exercise the questions of dharma and its relation to jati in his time. I'm directing us, like I said, first to the two texts, one by Gopinatha and the other by Padwar. So the Gopinatha text had become very important in the administrative circles of the British East India Company. And its sensibilities about caste and its essence had percolated into modern Marathi language and imagination, including dictionaries and popular literature. Believed to have been written between the middle 14th and 15th century, the Sanskrit manual for discernment of jatis offered a defense of the Varnashrama Dharma against the degenerated social condition of Varna Sankara or contamination or confusion of Varnas. Gopinatha described this as a state to be expected in the fallen age of Kali Yuga and portending great harm to Dharma in the world. Drawing on the corpus of Smriti and Shastra literature, it listed directly and rather crassly the actual parentage, jati appropriate occupations, and the entitlements on salvational ritual life. In Gopinatha's own scheme, the proliferation of mixed people was studied with clinical alacrity using the various anuloma and pratiloma combinations, right? So marrying up or down the castes. So Varna Sankara became a convenient formula to explain the origin and contemporary place of each community, along with an urgent anxiety to correct the contamination for the upholding of Dharma. As the caste hierarchies came to be challenged in the 18th century, a text like Jati Viveka came to be used by the British administration as well as other rulers to refute claims of castes of quote unquote deficient origin to ascend in the caste hierarchy. Jati Viveka standardized the Manava Dharma Shastra view of Varna Sankara as a contamination that occurs when good people, that is, people of higher castes, ignore their ritual obligations, enter into illegitimate relations, but most importantly, when they legitimate such relations by performing marriage. Now, the other text, that is Padwar's Zati Bheda Vivekasara, was embedded in these debates. So Padwar was already countering what Gopinatha had written in the 14th century because these texts were expressing the caste politics of colonial Maharashtra in the language of Varna Sankara. It became part of the articulations that rather than participating in proving the absence of crossover into what were considered lower Varnas, it argued the reverse. It spoke of Varna Sankara amongst all groups, especially the Brahmins. Right? This text was written in Marathi under the pseudonym Ek Hindu. The text was an autocritique and a lower caste commentary contending against the idea that Shudra Ati Shudras were the product of some kind of moral failure or Varna Sankara. Now we have evidence that this text was republished by Jotiba Phule in 1865 in its second edition and distributed and read aloud by the activists of the Satyashodhak Samaj at least till 1874. Padwar, of course, had attacked frontally the anchor of the dharmic definition of the caste order and had undertaken a close scrutiny of the Puranic Shastra texts, etc. He had used texts like the Sahyadri Khand, the Shudra Kamalakara. He had used the saint literature from Tukaram to Ramdas to Dhyaneshwar and so on and so forth. But though Jotiba published and distributed this text, it would seem that he simultaneously had begun to develop a different approach from that of Padwar's. Foremost, he declined to treat the Shudra as a religious category with any salvational and thus obligatory relation to the Aryabhatta Dharma. In his very first published work, which was a povada, a ballad that Phule wrote in 1869, he employed Shudra as a political category by referring to Shivaji as a Shudra Putra, and thereby developing his well-known thesis of an essential unity of all non-Brahmin castes against Aryabhatta Dharma. In doing this, Phule was displacing the essentiality of caste attributed to it by texts like Jati Viveka or Gopinatha, moving the sphere of caste contestation and its resolution from the divine to the worldly, that is, from the alaukika to the laukika. This distinction between the two spheres is a classic and recurrent distinction mentioned in the traditional thought, which takes several binary forms such as the material, the worldly, secular and religious, and so on and so forth. And we know via Partha Chatterjee's work that it is made to do some important work in the nationalist thought as well. But what underlies this is the distinction between the quality and episteme of knowledge that undergirds these two spheres, right? So there's already a sort of hierarchy between the Laukika and the Alaukika. This displacement of the essence of caste from the metaphysical to the physical is an important theoretical move in Phule. That is, he says the authority of caste does not come from the divine, it comes from this worldly. And this helped him to bypass the normative debates about what Shudra Dharma was and the salvational possibility of the Shudra within it. Jotiba's tract on Dharma, rather than criticizing the exclusion of the Shudra and the practice of hypergamy, establishes the worth of the Shudra and the superiority of women as evidential and manifest in the immanent physical world, thereby not giving away any anxieties about their place in the internal scheme of the Aryabhatta Dharma. I will now move to the second register, that is the Satya Dharma register, which is a replacing register. Now, in opposition to Aryabhatta Dharma, Jotiba mobilizes the term Satya Dharma, which is made to perform functions not only of comparison and evaluation, but also of reimagination. So, the use of the term Satya Dharma was not unheard of in Jotiba's time, and it was employed most purposefully by the Christian missionaries in colonial India. I'll develop an account here very briefly of how Jotiba uses Satya Dharma to speak of a faith that is true as opposed to the Aryabhatta Dharma in two respects. First is its conception of the physical natural world, an account which relies heavily on the works of William Paley and John Muir. Okay, so William Paley and John Muir both are naturalists, and I'll speak about them in a bit. So having used this conception, he then departs from both of them to establish this conception as a source of an immanent, this worldly sociality, reimagining the source of samaya or contract for his Satya Dharma. So for Phule, the Aryabhatta Dharma is based upon a false set of ideas, right? He calls them naslele vichar in Marathi, which is spoiled ideas. And he says it is the critical examination of such ideas that is a work towards truth. In the text and in his work in general, the influence of Scottish missionary education is evident. He went to a Scottish missionary school. At its core, Paley held that, and Paley was part of the curriculum, so we know that he must have read Paley. Paley held that the evident physical order of things, which is intricate and sufficient, is an argument for the necessity of an intelligent designing mind. Okay, so it's a designed universe. Though there is no textual evidence that Phule had read Paley, we know that because of the fact that he went to a Scottish missionary school and he had definitely read Muir, who used a lot of Paley, we can say that there is a lot of influence and evidence of evidentiary theology in his work. Jotiba, like I said, most likely encountered Paley's work through John Muir's work, which he read and cited in Shetkaranचा Asur, which is another work of Phule's. Muir also wrote a text called Mata Pariksha, which most likely informed some of the ways in which Jotiba chooses to argue about the Satya Dharma in his SSD. And their views are quite comparable. So first, let's speak on the influence of Paley's natural theology. It is not that Jotiba hadn't considered other views of creation in the debates over Satya Dharma, especially given that Christian missionaries too invoked the non-theological sources such as developments in natural sciences to refute certain claims of Hindu faith. In this, Moir was instrumental since he moved away from the strategy of attacking the pundits who would argue about faith with him on moral grounds to arguments based on evidence, science, test of reason, and so on. So there's a sort of live debate which was going on between the Christian missionaries and the pundits. So Jotiba knew both Moir and Darwin well and had considered other theories of creation also quite seriously. However, it seems that by 1883, he was convinced that scientific explanations of what creation was and how it came to be didn't have a necessary bearing on the interpretative worldview required for the public religion of truth. In his Shetkarancha Asud, for example, he states that debating about the accuracy of the theories of creation, whether from Buddhism, Jainism, Darwin, the Bible, or the Arya Brahmins, was not useful. It was more pertinent and relevant to think about how beings, once created, interacted with nature and then with each other over time to form groups, villages, and then societies. This way of thinking will become very crucial in what he will develop as a necessary sociality. So it is from here that he develops a conception of dharma as sociality and not as identity. Secondly, and more consequently, though Jyotiba adopted some ways of thinking about the natural world from Paley and Moore, he also took some sharp departures from them. Just as he realized the uselessness of strictly scientific arguments on the subject of dharma, he also used the test of reason more neutrally than Moore. He thus held that no one religion, scripture, or revelation was sufficient to be relevant to all humans across all space and time. Um, and like I said, because there was a lot of debate going on between the pundits uh, and the Christian missionaries, which we see in the Mata Pariksha debates. The Mata Pariksha debates had shown that defenders of Hindu faith, such as Somnatha, could simultaneously be both ardent believers and defenders of the scientific principles, such as the system of Copernicus, but also zealously defend the Puranic claims about astronomy by using the distinction of Laukika and the Alaukika. So they said whatever was were the principles that were coming from the Alaukika, from the divine, did not they could not be challenged from whatever findings we have about this world, right? And this was a real challenge for Jyotiba's thinking. So he therefore brings this separation to uh, a really critical examination, right? So by challenging this separation and bringing value and virtue to the Laukika, this worldly, without desacralizing it, was both necessary and important for Jyotiba. And it is here that his departure from Paley and Moore takes course. So Phule's Satya Dharma was a dharma of this world. In this, he drew on Palean theology, but it went further. It completely refuted the presence of superiority of the Alaukika. So he destabilizes the divine, whether as a site of the genesis of the Brahminical Vedas or the Christian revelation. The sanctity and authority of the scriptures and revelation held no continuance in his scheme. His specific feud with the Alaukika, the site from where Dharma flowed in the Aryabhata Dharma, was that it was inaccessible. Whereas, if one were to make the Laukika and the Samuha, the people themselves, the generative site of Dharma, it was already a public Dharma, that is Sarvajanik. So that's how he comes to the articulation of the Sarvajanik Satya Dharma. Moving on then to the final and the third register, in which Dharma was being reinterpreted in this period, was in its characteristic rational discernment in the upper caste reform circles, right? So this is modern or near modern nationalist articulations. In this rationalization of caste, the caste order was indicative of a hierarchy of values, right? And not of persons by birth. And thus, the necessary corrective was to remove birth status from the equation, which was deemed a corruption to the original envisaging of the system. Moreover, it was this corruption, a diversion, that was responsible for the Kali Yuga, where Britishers had become rulers, and the task, therefore, was to return to that original ordering of values and not a complete overhaul of one's beliefs. In the Pune of 1880s, such views were becoming popular with the non-Brahmin writers. Dadova Pandurang Tarkhadkar, who was a grammarian and a member of the Prarthana Samaj, in his book called Dharma Vivechana, took the view that jati was not a matter of birth but virtues, And thus, what the hierarchy of castes denoted was the hierarchy of virtues. Though this view was reformative, as it argued that potentially anyone was capable of intellectual ability, it nevertheless looked at Shudra's life and manual labor as deficient and low. This view repeats itself again and again. So, for example, in Ambedkar's time, it comes as the Chaturya Varna argument, which I'm sure most of you must be acquainted with, as it comes up in the Annihilation of Caste, also, right? There are other important thinkers of the time who take up that view, including Lokahitwadi, right? So Lokhitvadi himself, for example, characterized the Brahmin as an abstract ideal with a true Brahminness that was characterized by scholarly pursuit and practice of good deeds and ability to make reasoned judgments, to distinguish truth from falsehood, and it had nothing to do with birth. So, in other words, to seek truth itself was adjudged a characteristic of Brahmanatva, right? So, Satya Shodhan was a Brahmin characteristic. The desirable aim was to attain such high virtues, and Lokhitwadi derided the Brahmins of his time for fixation with rituals, etc. So these are the kind of arguments that is the third register which Jotiba counters, right? Jotiba had been fairly critical of such a reformist view of upper caste reformers. The abstraction of caste system into a gradation of virtues for him meant that until social conditions were completely transformed, the gradation of people could continue. Is this the way Arya Brahmins will improve this ill-fated country? He asked of Ranade in a letter that he wrote to him. Jotiba was equally critical of the educated non-Brahmins who joined the Sarvajanik Sabha, and he confronted them publicly in newspapers. Uh, right, so I'll skip those details, but what he basically does is he appeals that the figures, right? So the Shudra figures who are respected in the scripture, he says they are respected by Brahmins as Brahmins despite their mothers being from lower castes. And here he hits back and he makes the Shudras ask if the Brahmins would have treated these people with the same respect if they were children of Shudra men and not of Shudra women, right? So gender is something that he really brings in here, right? So what we have therefore is hypogamy becomes part of the argument of Dharma. Jyotiba thus complicates the secularization of caste, which is sought by upper caste reformists for a genuine secularization, bringing in the question of gender. And he says it can't be limited to the displacement of birth based groups by virtue based groups. It would demand erasing endogamous boundaries, especially between the two extreme entities in the Varna Sankara scheme, the Shudra and the woman. Thereby, the position of the Shudras and women in the Varnashrama Dharma and the Swadharma is exposed as being the same. For Jyotiba, therefore, they are not really distinct from each other. Upper caste reformers employed the same descriptive strategy of the corruption of the golden past as responsible for the deplorable condition of Hindu women and the segregation of Brahmin women as they did in the case of Shudras, right? So this is the sort of third register. I think in one of the most important articulations that he makes on Dharma, when in this tract, when Yashwant, who's the interlocutor, asks Jyotiba the reason why there is so much pain. So he says, why is there so much pain and discontent in the world? And it is here that Jyotiba puts forward probably the most radical notions of Dharma. He says, and I quote, overall, mothers, sisters, daughters, and female grandchildren are considered to be an extremely shrewd tribe who are blamed very easily for everything and are treated as if they are bonded servants who were acquired in a conquest. All of this is something that impedes the truth, and therefore the world is an unhappy place and there is no dharma. Right? So that is the kind of definition of dharma, which is based not on identity but on reciprocity, how you treat others. So it is the unequal treatment and control over women, implicit and justified in Swadharma under the garb of honor and identity, that he says is an impediment to a possible observance of a Satya Dharma. Right? So, in conclusion, I just want to say that Jyotiba's Dharma, therefore, is not group contingent. It's not just for the Aryans, for particular Varnas, for Satya Shodhaks, or even for the non Brahmins. It is, in that sense, theoretically universalizable. Its universal nature, though, is limited to humans, right? So that is, dharma is not conceived of a universal law that orders the world. Rather, it is a specific disposition that humans are to develop towards each other. Since it denies caste groups' identities any essentiality, it also dissolves their status as a mode of observance to achieve any, salvational ends. Since groups as collectives have no essentiality, the contracts emanating or prescribed to them as dharma have no sanctity either. In doing this, Jyotiba's dharma breaks convention with the conflation of a group as defined by a code of conduct, where both identity and code are derived from divine segregation of varnas. He frees dharma from divine constitution of people and their respective mandate. Moreover, it detaches itself from other ways of thinking about dharma in the Indian tradition as a cosmic law, a social order that is a priori, and inaugurates a sociality as a generative site for dharma as a norm for reciprocity. In this view, people derive their sense of obligation to each other from an outlook towards the world as immanent and sufficient. The nirmik, that is the creator's universe, is a self-sufficient and interdependent one, and thus realizing the truth of such a physical natural world meant reenacting the social code mirrored from the scheme of creation but not derived from it. Finally, Jyotiba's dharma resists secularization of caste and its presentation as a nationalist swadharma by showing its proximity to varna dharma. So therefore, what Sarvajanik Satyadharma as a tract does is that it challenges the persistent ways of thinking around dharma in the tradition. It destabilizes the alleged intrinsic relationship between jati and its social codes, where its members and the observance of dharma. And in raising such challenges, he inaugurates a particular strand of non-Brahmin way of Indian thinking, that seeks a reasoning from within the immanent world, which is not desacralized, but imagines the sources and modes of sacralization primarily within egalitarian human sociality. So it is sociality and reciprocity that is the site of sacred. That is where the sacred is generated, thereby arguing for human sociality itself as a generative site of norms and therefore of dharma. So I think I'll stop here and I look forward to the questions. I hope I didn't shoot the time.
No, it's exactly 4:35. Like you said, it will be within 30 minutes. Thank you so much, Dr. Ingole, for expanding on how Phule, Sarvajanik, Satyadharma, how you see it as an intertextual category and see Phule's ideas as a very noble way of understanding a non-Brahmanic way of Dharma. It has been very dense for me, so I was like jotting notes. I hope now I invite Pratham if he has any questions, doubts, ideas, thoughts about the paper, and then we can open the floor to questions from the participants. I'm so sorry, my camera is off. The connectivity here is quite poor. I had to switch it off. I apologize. Pratham?
Yeah, cool. Am I audible? Yeah, cool. Firstly, thank you so much for this talk. It was really enlightening, and so was your paper. Just a side note, I think I got introduced to Professor Ingole's work back in fifth semester of undergrad, and it was Talim sir who introduced us. And it was this paper on Tarabai Shinde and Mukta Salvi that we got introduced to. And I think that's one paper, that one essay, which has stayed with me till very long. And it has also significantly informed the way I think about caste and question. And so, to be able to talk to people whose writing has made you think is both nerve-wracking but also an extremely thrilling experience. So just that, a shout out to TheDaak for making it possible, and also to Talim sir. Just three questions. Yeah. So first, quite early on in your paper and in your talk, you talk about how, despite operating in a period which was marked by vibrant presence of textual exchange and recording, there is very little in terms of intertextual and interliterary context when it comes to Phule. I was wondering, what can we attribute this under-researched nature to? So is it just the fact that Phule belongs to a particular caste, that he hasn't been recorded, his context hasn't been recorded, or is it something to do with the way scholars have done intellectual history? Is it a methodological problem too that has generated this sparse literature and context? Question two, there is this very interesting bit in your paper about the question of orthography in discussions around the evaluation of Fule's work. And orthography, as we would know, isn't just about spellings or how you write things, but is something that is also deeply embroiled in questions of power and how it operates. So how do we then see these orthographical quote unquote mistakes in Fule's work? And last question, Fule's reworking of Dharma brings two very important moves, at least for me. One, it sort of delinks the Samua and the Samaya conflation, thus saying that, oh, caste isn't an essential thing, and therefore occupation doesn't provide it its essentiality, but also it brings the samya to the immanent world, thus allowing for Samuha and the Laukika to be the sites from which rules of Dharma come forth based on sociality, reciprocity, and respect. Yet, as you later note, this Samaya of the Laukik isn't desacralized, right? It still is sacred and there is enchantment to it. So I was wondering what emphasis on this sacrality does for Phule's purpose of Satya Dharma. Or maybe how do we read this tension between it being Laukik but at the same time being sacred? So just that, yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, first of all, hi, Pratham. Uh, we've been conversing over emails, but yeah, this is the first time I'm seeing you. Thank you for these, first of all, for carefully going through the work and for these wonderful questions. So, the first question about is this a larger intellectual history problem or is it something that is particular to Phule? I think it's both. Uh, in doing intellectual history, especially contextualist intellectual history in the Indian textual tradition, it is a challenge because the way textual tradition unfolds in our context is quite different, right? Because the way even in the ancient or what is called the Astika tradition, we don't have a tradition of people necessarily citing from where they're taking stuff. A lot of times you don't have names of authors, so they don't feel the need to put in their names and so on and so forth. So we don't have a very, citation based system in the first place. But in the case of Phule, I think it becomes a more granulated problem because he does not belong to any school of thought or philosophy, right? In fact, even people who criticize Phule later on and they want to bracket the Satya Shodhaks as one school of thought, find it very difficult to say that they're writing in a certain tradition, etc. So there are people who are writing from the scratch. At times, they're just writing for performing, for taking their poetry to schools, to people, and so on and so forth. So there's also something particular about the way they write. But there is, of course, also a problem of the archive and the recovery of the archive. We know that because of poverty, the second generation itself had to sell out all the books and writings and manuscripts that they had because the daughter-in-law of the Phules did not have any money and she had to sort of really sell those off. So we don't really have that kind of stable archive and we don't know what books they really own, where they are. So the recovery that we have is also quite patchy, right? So I think there are these layered reasons of why the archive is not as stable as it is. But I think that brings me to the second question of orthography. Whatever recovery has also happened through the lenses of what is considered as standard literature, right? And acceptable literature, acceptable writing, and so on and so forth. And Jotiba is very subversive in his writing, right? And I think he does it deliberately. So there are, in fact, a lot of instances where when he's writing to someone like Ranade, and he's basically the language commission editor and so on and so forth. So when he's writing to these people who are in positions of power, he's using the most subversive language. So he'll use Urdu words and Hindi words and Marathi words and so on and so forth. So there is that subversion, but the debates on orthography around the recovery of Phule's is something that is pretty central. You might have read that in the Savitri paper. So there's a record of when you have these consolidated volumes coming out on both Savitribai Phule and Jotiba Phule, there's a lot of contestation on whether they are really their works or not, whether they could really have written something like this, were they capable of it? Is this language worth considering, being published? Can it be considered poetry? Can it be considered prose? And so on and so forth. So the orthography debates and their evidence is much sharper in the case of Savitri, so far as I have found it so far, and not so much in the case of Phule. But from the writings of Phule, it seems like he really doesn't care about what the standard language is, and in fact he wants to defy that convention. And in fact he signs off one of the letters saying to something, he says buddhe ka salam, right? So he just subverts whatever are the requirements of the time. So that's on the orthography question. The final question about the reworking and the sacralization question, I think I underline that all the more, that though there is a separation of the samuha and the samaya, right? So the contract and its validity is coming not from some divine sanction, but from this world, from how we treat each other in the laukika, in the worldly. But nevertheless, it is not completely desacralized. I do that because I think the dominant readings on Phule uh, blame him, whether in praise or in criticism, of a lot of rationalization, right? Of vacating all enchantment, etc. So he's seen as a rationalist. And I think that is a very wrong reading of him, primarily because the archive or whatever he's written shows that that is not the case, right? But that sacralization or the enchantment comes from the amazement and love for the natural world to a large extent. He's based quite deeply in the agrarian world. And we see this both in the writings of Jotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule. There's so much appreciation for nature, for agriculture, for the manual work that comes from the reciprocity between humans and the natural world, right? So there's that. Then there is, of course, a lot that he writes on the Bari Rajya, right? So this benevolent king and the kingdom of a farmer king. So there's also that kind of sacralization which is there. And finally, like I said, there is sacralization between human beings themselves and the relationships that they have with each other, how you treat each other. So the location of enchantment is shifted from the alaukika to the laukika. But I think a closer reading will show that there is a different side of enchantment and a different register of enchantment which has been invoked, rather than completely evacuating the space with all kinds of normative and moralistic understanding of what it means to be practicing Satya Dharma. So I hope that answers all your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ingole, for such in-depth answers. If any participants have any questions, they can either type them in the chat box or they can unmute themselves and share their questions. Um, I think people are still thinking because it was quite a dense, heavy paper. So I hadn't read the paper beforehand. So while you were speaking, I tried to open it up and I realized that it had a lot of crux and it was very thorough. And I think it'll take me a lot of time to go through it. Pratham and I were discussing
For
it.
me,
Yes.
it feels like I'm in my class. So
So, is this usually like it? People are not able to comprehend because
no,
it,
no, I mean,
No, after you.
please go ahead.
After you. No, I think there are only two ways when this happens, and I think it's the latter. It's not the first that it's not comprehensible. That's because perhaps you've not read it. I think
yeah.
it's the latter, which is when something is so. I mean, there's not at one point where she's minced words. She's actually given, there are three
Yeah.
reasons for it: reason one, reason two, reason three. I think it was so comprehensive that the question isn't coming up. Because you haven't read it is why you feel
Yeah, that's what,
that
that's
it's
what.
not comprehensive. No, I'm sure there might be questions. Otherwise,
We can wait for a while.
yeah. Or I could ask a question if,
Sure.
yeah. So, I mean, many congratulations for bringing out this side because from what I see, even when I've taught this paper on Dharma, And at Delhi University, they kind of, it's a patchwork of how they've put together the syllabus. But to me, it seems that the way that in which you're bringing Phule in, I don't think it's been brought up, especially in the way it's been designed. So when we look at Dharma, there's a certain way in which, especially for students of politics, there seems to be a centrality of state. And what would then be the role of the state in dharma, right? So raj dharma is one concept, and for me, the part where you answer a question for Pratham, where you said that there's a certain way in which the imagination of a benevolent king, or a benevolent villager who's going to be comes up. Would you like to speak a little bit about that, in terms of how does one, because when we are teaching dharma, or at least trying to make sense of it, especially within ancient medieval political thought, a whole lot of that exposition is on the question of what is the king's role, what would be the raj dharma, what would a dharmic quote unquote rule look like. And I was wondering, if we were to bring Phule in, what could students of politics take in that classroom?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, to begin with, I think a lot of these anti-caste thinkers struggle with the obsession that that is really a obsession with the nationalist spirit, right? So, to articulate dharma as Raj Dharma is a colonial obsession, right? It's something that we have to invent to a certain extent, right? And they are struggling with this priority to the political over the social, right? All of them. Ambedkar is writing about it. Phule is writing about it, not in such explicit terms, but they're all saying that if you want to establish a political, you have to have some grasp of what the social is, because it is from there that the principles of your polity are going to come up. Ambedkar is more explicit. Ambedkar says it is essential for democracy, right? That is Ambedkar's saying, right? Now, if we were to then ask what is the relationship of the Raj Dharma, and by Raj, if we say, the political understanding of Dharma, to this understanding of Dharma as sociality, I think one of the imaginations, the utopian imaginations that we get from Phule that might be able to speak to this concern is the Bairajya understanding, wherein he speaks about the farmer king. The king himself is a farmer, and he's a benevolent farmer. And he in fact says that there's a lot of morphology that Phule uses. There's a lot of linguistic work that he does. And he says that all these non-high gods, such as Khandoba, and there's Jezuri and all of these places. So he says these people were in fact, they were ministers of the Bari king, right? So today you have forgotten your history. And these basically were the part of this benevolent administration under the farmer ruler. And there was no principle of extraction in it, right? So Phule is also an interesting economic thinker in that sense. So the whole argument about Ghulamgiri and slavery, that also comes in there. And he says by benevolent, it is meant on production, but it's also very sustainable production, agrarian production, and so on and so forth. But in that context, I don't think those who want to extract a conception of Raja Dharma would get sufficient material, because here the Dharma is something that is coming from sociality. It is not coming from the relationship of the ruler and the ruled as such, because the ruler is seen as someone who's just like us, a farmer, and so on and so forth. But I think as we progress from the colonial period towards it, there are so many reworkings of the conception of dharma. So you have, in the anti-caste tradition, let me speak about it. So in Phule, you have Satya Dharma, right? In people like Ayodhithas, you have Tamil Buddhism. In Periyar, you have, again, Samadharma. In Ambedkar, you have Dhamma. And I think when we speak about the modern conceptions of dharma, the understanding of dhamma as something that is integral to our understanding of democratic polity, that does have some percolation into the constitution. So I think when we are speaking in the class or otherwise of Rajadharma doesn't necessarily have to be from the Chanakya kind of understanding of Rajadharma, but also from this democratic understanding of a democratic polity and its dharma. So I think there's a lot of material in the anti-caste thinkers to develop that genealogy. And I think this is a small part of that larger project. So, I mean, yeah, if I don't know if I've answered your question, but these are my sort of preliminary thoughts. Yeah.
You've answered my question, yes, and uh, in the most astute manner, in terms of also connecting it with the larger genealogy of what would, because Dhamma is something that could be touched, that is touched upon, but not in terms of this larger body of work that could bring that genealogy out. So it's suddenly from Kautilya and Manu, we start talking about Ambedkar and
Right.
Dharma without really being able to pull other sources in. So, yeah, thank you. I think there's a question in the chat box. We would like to read the question out because sometimes we have differently able participants who may not be able to read the chat box by themselves. Chetna, are you around or do you want me to
Yes,
read?
yes.
Okay, okay.
Hello, Dr. Ingole. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. This is Suhasini, by the way. Suhasini says that by foregrounding reciprocity in Phule's understanding of dharma, your paper appears to propose an alternative normative basis for political community. How might this conception of reciprocity challenge or enrich dominant liberal or communitarian models of political obligation?
Sure. Shall I answer?
Sure, sure, please.
Okay. Thank you, Suhasini, for that very perceptive question. I think, yeah, so it does propose an alternative normative basis of political community, though I would hesitate a bit to use the word political community in a way that we understand it today and ascribe it to Phule. But yeah, there is a sort of sociality which is being imagined. Um, and that sociality is supposed to be the ground for dharma in this case. I don't know whether it can be stretched in Phule to political community, but like I said, if we were to use these anti-caste thinkers as a resource of thinking about larger questions that we are facing or we are, struggling with in larger political theory or political philosophy, this question. So there's this rich debate, right, between the liberals and the communitarians, and that debate is basically on the conception of the self, right? So you have this great piece by Charles Taylor who speaks about the liberal communitarian debate, and he says that this is a debate at cross purposes because it is at cross purposes because the understanding of the self that the communitarians have is very different from the understanding of the self that the liberals have. And the communitarian argument is that we are speaking of a very different ontology of the self. Our understanding of the self itself is coming from a different conception of being, and so on and so forth. And I think it's very interesting to ask, let's say via Phule or via Ambedkar, uh, as to what is the conception of the self if we put or if we bring in reciprocity as the central principle of identity, right? So if it is reciprocity that is the basis of identity, okay, I'm not speaking yet about political obligation, but of identity itself, then what is the ontology of the self that we are talking about? And I think it is, of course, it is different from the liberal individualist ontology of the self, but I think the anti-caste thinkers have something very important to say to the communitarian model of self and identity itself, right? And what I think they have to say is that you can't take political community as something that is, already always present, but it is something that is generative, and it is generated by the modes and processes of reciprocity that a society can develop and can continue to develop. I think in Ambedkar, one can read this as a sort of disposition towards democracy, right? So he speaks about associative life. And the associative life is not just a political obligation, but it is a requirement of the self itself. So therefore, I think it is a sort of dynamism between the polity and the social. I don't think these anti-caste thinkers think of the social and the political as something that can exist in separation of each other. So the political obligation itself would be something that uses a notion of a reciprocal identity, and therefore a sort of dynamic channel between the self, that is a social self, and a self that is a politically obliged self. So I definitely think that it can enrich the debate and take the understanding of the ontology of self and identity and its relationship to the social and political further.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ingole. If there are any more questions, we can have them in the chat box or people can unmute themselves. I think, yes.
Thank you,
Suhasini
Suhasini.
takes, yeah, Suhasini says thank you so much. Um,
Let's wait 20 seconds if somebody's typing
sure.
their message, and otherwise I think
Yes,
we've
we can
had
really do it.
we've had a 1 hour long session, which was very comprehensive. I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather and I keep going off.
Are you in Delhi?
Yes,
Okay. So that's understandable.
hence.
Saddam
Has a
has,
question.
yes, they have turned on their camera. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I was driving. Uh, many congratulations to TheDaak for keeping, all the good work that they're doing. I missed the presentation, but I listened to the last last portions of our brilliant presentation. So I have nothing to say, just that you guys are doing great, and I hope you keep doing it. Thank you.
Okay. So that I think that was an appreciation and not
I would like
necessarily.
to join him in congratulating you guys in doing this great work. And these are really brilliant and great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking out the time. I would request Chetna to officially do the vote of thanks, but on behalf of the team at TheDaak, we are a very small initiative. We're very young, early career researchers, and some of the students from undergrad and postgrad who try doing this every Saturday. So thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking about your paper with us. In fact, some of our colleagues are sending us texts that they would want to come back sometime and watch this on YouTube because of several different commitments they couldn't be here. So we'd also be happy to share that link to you as well as to others. Thank you so much. Chetna?
I think you've done already. You've done it. Thank you so much, Dr. Ingole, for making the time to be here with us on a Saturday. We really appreciate it. And I also would like to thank all our participants for being here. This is a paper that I think has garnered the interest of a lot of people from JNU as well, because people were asking me for the link, and I kept sending them from Hindu, where we were taught your paper, as Pratham mentioned. So thank you so much to everyone for joining in. We will see you next Saturday around the same time, the next Baithak. Thank you so much.
Thank you.